may, in a minute or two, ask if Pastor June Gonzalez can lead us in prayer, if your mic is working okay tonight. So, Brother John Cheek is a recent graduate at BJU, graduated with his doctorate. You can see a little bit of his work in kind of a more concise form on the BJU website, the seminary website that went up recently. I've known John from a distance, for maybe 10 years or so. So we were not really overlapping with each other. But after I finished my time there, he also did some work there in teaching Greek. And then subsequently now, he has finished his doctorate. The topic we'll talk through tonight is his PhD dissertation. I'm excited about it just because I've dipped into it and very much benefited from it. And I have no doubt that we will benefit from it tonight. The concept of what we're doing here is on the assumption or on the framework that we've already studied through the method, and then we have two sessions tonight and next time. Having talked through the framework or the method, they're basically showing us what this looks like. So they're basically demonstrating for us an entire summary work with the results. And that's going to include all of the pieces that we've talked about. I mean, the work that he's done is going to take us right through biblical, systematic, and even, I mean, it's worldliness. So it's definitely going to connect to practical, historical. I mean, it has to. So it will show us the broad picture, the fruits, the results of theological method. And that's the rationale for what we're doing. Okay, Pastor June Gonzalez, you're able to lead us in prayer. And then right after that, Brother John Cheek, we're looking forward to hearing from you. And that'll be it. Amen. Thank you, sir. Okay, great. Brother John Cheek.
All right, thank you. As Joel said, the topic we'll be discussing today is a biblical theology of the world. And I'm excited to be able to spend this time with you today, to be able to share some of the things that I've learned. And this, as Joel said, this was the topic of my dissertation that I completed last year. And I'm grateful for this opportunity. So I trust it'll be beneficial for all of you. I have a PowerPoint that I was trying to display, but my computer is not letting me do it. So
You're on now.
Okay.
We see it.
All right. So
right.
All right, and then
so far we're just seeing the blank macOS desktop. But
okay, how's that?
Perfect.
All right. So I became interested in doing a study on a biblical theology of the world because I believe there's a significant confusion in the American church about what the world is and what worldliness is and how the Christians should live in a worldly culture. And the New Testament presents several clear statements about the church's posture toward the world. And so it's not a concept that's difficult to find in the New Testament, but it is a concept that has that there's a lot of confusion around. And so I wanted to understand it better. And so I wanted to undertake sort of a biblical theology of the world. Some of those key statements are, for example, in John 17, verses 14 through 16, Jesus says, "I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. And so what Jesus is doing here is he's presenting these two contrasting groups of people. You have the world, who hates believers and who hates Jesus. And the world hates believers in Jesus because we are not of the world. So the easy solution would be then to take us out of the world, right? Well, Jesus says he doesn't want to take us out of the world, but he wants to protect us from the evil one while we are in the world. So John's theology of the world is quite prominent, and we'll be looking at some examples from John's theology later on. Paul says in Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. So again, Paul is saying believers need to be cautious and concerned that they're not conformed to this world. James also says, you adulterous people, do you know friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. And so James is doing something similar to what John and Paul have done. And he contrasts two different sides. There's the world, and there's an enemy relationship between the world and God, and the world and believers. And then probably the most well-known text about the world is in 1 John 2:15. John says, do not love the world or the things in the world. And if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And so John cautions believers about loving the world. And so the problem with the world, John helps us understand, is that the world is in the power of the evil one. So he says, we know in 1 John 5:19, we know that we are from God, and the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. And that's why we should not love the world. So we have a number of pretty blatant statements about what the believer's responsibility is toward the world. But in spite of these passages, there is a lack of clarity in the church today. There's some confusion about the world and what the world is and how Christians should relate to the world. For hundreds of years now, Christian theologians have spoken of spiritual warfare as in terms of the church having three enemies: the world and the flesh and the devil. And so some have called this the unholy trinity. And so Paul in Ephesians 2 verses 2 and 3 mentions all three of these together. He says that believers had been dead in their sins and they were following the course of this world, which means that they were following after the prince of the power of the air. So that's the world and the devil. And when they were doing that, they were living in the passions of their flesh. And so Paul lists all three of those in the same passage, and we'll spend some more time on Ephesians 2 later on. So it's been quite clear throughout the last several centuries that the world is an enemy of the church and believers. Over the past century, though, the church and biblical scholarship have not given enough serious attention to the world. In the 1940s, C.S. Lewis, in the Screwtape Letters, writing as the demon Screwtape, says, since the enemy's servants have been preaching about the world as one of the great standard temptations for 2,000 years, this might seem difficult to do. But fortunately, they have said very little about it for the last few decades. So what C.S. Lewis is saying there is that for hundreds of years, the church has been warning its people about the dangers of the world. But for the last few decades, they had not been. Later on in James Davidson Hunter's book, Evangelicalism, The Coming Generation, Hunter says the words worldly and worldliness have, within a generation, lost most of their traditional meaning. The church is just not clear on what worldliness is. And so this ignorance of biblical teaching on the world reflects the lack of attention given to the concept by evangelical scholars. David Wells, in one of his books critiquing the evangelical church, he says that the evangelical church fails to recognize worldliness because it thinks of worldliness as a social rather than a theological reality. And he says worldliness is so frequently being missed or misjudged in the evangelical church today. He says it takes theological sense and theological judgment to recognize it, and that is precisely what has disappeared from the church. Another evangelical criticizing the evangelical movement, Robert Gundry, says that the sense of embattlement with the world is rapidly evaporating among many evangelicals. Gundry argues that the greater evangelical participation in cultural endeavors and politics and academics has resulted in a blurring of the distinction between believers and the world. So a few evangelical scholars are putting warnings out there about the world, and they're noting that the evangelical church is ignoring a lot of the biblical theology of the world. And the fact that these leaders have to keep calling for a change, and they keep noting this change, demonstrates that the problem is still existing. One of the primary reasons I believe there's such confusion is that there's such a lack of theological development on the topic of the world. It's not one of the popular areas of theology to discuss today. Most people want to discuss other issues to meet people's felt needs, and the world just doesn't fit well in that. There have been some brief and specialized studies on the world, particularly relating to a New Testament concept of the world. Especially in John's writings, there have been a number of articles about the word cosmos and about how John uses world. But there is a significant gap in the literature. There's been no significant, thorough biblical theological study of the concept of world. And this gap in the literature became a primary catalyst in writing my dissertation on a theology of the world. So what I began trying to do is understand what the world is by looking at the New Testament, because the New Testament does have very clear passages on, but there are very few works that discuss the New Testament teaching thoroughly. As I was thinking through this, I also realized that if this is a prominent concept in the New Testament, the word world occurs over 200 times in the New Testament, it would seem odd for the concept of the world not to have a conceptual foundation in the Old Testament. Now, the Old Testament does not use the word world in the same way that the New Testament uses the word world. It never uses the word world in the way John uses it, where he says don't love the world. So the word isn't there. So when you're not able to find a correlation between those words between the testaments, it is legitimate to look for that same concept in the Old Testament and the New Testament. One example of this, for example, is in Brian Rossner's article on biblical theology in the New Dictionary of Biblical Theology. He points out that the kingdom of God is well known to be a prominent concept in the overarching plan of Scripture. And the Old Testament looks forward to the kingdom of God, and the New Testament starts to fulfill that expectation of the kingdom of God, and it shows how that expectation is realized. Now, the New Testament frequently uses references to the kingdom using the word kingdom. Jesus comes preaching the kingdom, and Paul keeps talking about the kingdom of God. However, the Old Testament doesn't talk about it with those same terms. It uses other terms that are related to the concept. It uses terms like we're looking forward to a king and a ruler, and there's going to be someone who will come and have dominion. So it uses related terms to refer to the concept, but it doesn't necessarily use the same terminology throughout. So I began working through the Old Testament, and I noticed that the distinction between Israel and the surrounding nations seem to have parallels to the distinction the New Testament makes between the church and the world. Now, I disagree with the idea that the church has replaced Israel, but I do believe that there's a parallel concept going on. In the Old Testament, Israel represents the people of God. Now, not every Israelite was a true believer in Yahweh, just like not every person who calls himself a member of the church is a true member of the church. But there is a general idea that in the Old Testament, Israel represents the people of God, and the nations represent the outside world, the people who are opposed to developing the kingdom of God. And I also recognize that in the Old Testament, there were people who were Gentiles who became followers of Yahweh. But there is a general distinction between Israel and the way God wanted his people to live in distinction from the world. So then I started going back through the Old Testament to find out where this distinction begins and why it's there. The first references to nations occurs around Genesis 10 and 11 with the Table of Nations and the Tower of Babel. And then the more I studied, the more I realized that this distinction between the people of God and the people of this world goes back to earlier chapters in Genesis. For example, you see in Genesis chapters 4 through 6, the development of two different lines of seed, one coming from Cain, the other is coming from Seth. One of them seems to be a righteous line of people that culminates in Noah, and the other seems to turn into a very wicked group of people that fills the earth with wickedness. So we have this distinction between the people of God and wicked people since Genesis 4. And those two lines of seed start in Genesis 4. And then I believe that we need to move back to the previous chapter to see why those two lines of seed began developing. And so then we come to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. And this is where we have the initial seed promise. And it says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So this is God's statement to the serpent after he tempted Adam and Eve. And he promises that there will be offspring. Now I'm going to use the word offspring and seed interchangeably. Different English translations use either seed or offspring. So there's an expectation that there's going to be offspring. And from Genesis to Revelation, the Bible describes the story of the people of God and their enmity with the serpent and his seed. The main reason I gave you the Waltke article to read before this class is that Waltke is the only other author I have been able to find who looks at Genesis 3:15 and sees the seed promise and believes that the seed promise in Genesis 3:15 finds its ultimate fulfillment in the enmity between the church and the world in the New Testament. And so I believe this concept is there and it's in Scripture and it permeates through the Old Testament and then the New Testament. And that's what we're going to be reviewing today. There are very few treatments of the world that even acknowledge that there's an Old Testament concept involved. And so Randy Leedy is one of those. He wrote a book on the world and argues that the Old Testament does serve as the foundation, but he doesn't quite go back to Genesis 3:15 for this. So when it comes to Genesis 3:15, though, there are significant interpretive issues that we have to look at. We could spend a whole 2 hours talking about Genesis 3:15. The first chapter of my dissertation addresses Genesis 3:15 and the correct interpretation of Genesis 3:15. Historically, throughout the history of the church, Christian theologians have understood Genesis 3:15 to be a protevangelium, the first message, the gospel delivered to the church. And many of the Christians who believe that understood that this is a messianic prophecy. The one who's going to bruise or crush the head of the serpent is the coming Messiah. And he is going to be the seed of the woman, and he's going to do battle with the serpent and defeat the serpent. Around the 1800s, though, Enlightenment rationalism took over much of the prominent theologians, and they started to argue that Moses, for example, could not have understood this early on that there would be a future Messiah. So this can't really be a reference to the Messiah, because Moses didn't have any concept of the Messiah, and if he did, he would have made it more clear than this. So a lot of liberal theologians, even to today, view Genesis 3:15 as a statement that says that there will be enmity between women and snakes. And so the argument here is that this is a natural result of the fall, is that because of the history of Eve and this serpent, that women will be scared of snakes. Now, conservative Christian theologians, for the most part, reject that idea, and they do see that this is a protevangelium, a message of the gospel. Most of the basis for an individual reference to the seed, for a messianic understanding of Genesis 3:15, before the 1990s, though, was based on the idea of progressive revelation. So Moses may not have understood that this was going to be an individual messianic figure who would come and crush Satan. But we find out as we read the rest of Scripture that that's what was happening here. And so most conservative theologians would argue, based on progressive revelation or a sensus plenior interpretation, or using typology, that this was a reference to the future individual Messiah. However, in the 1990s, since the 1990s, there's been something of a renaissance in a conservative interpretation of Genesis 3:15. And some arguments have been propounded that really help support the idea that it's exegetically necessary that Genesis 3:15 does refer and expect an individual. The first argument for this is based on the literary composition of Genesis and the Pentateuch. And T. Desmond Alexander wrote a number of articles and essays in the 1990s discussing this, and John Sailhamer also, in his works on the Pentateuch, addressed this issue. And they argue that Genesis 3:15 is expecting a seed. And they focus on the prominence of the seed concept in Genesis. And so what Alexander argues is that throughout Genesis, we are the book is tracing a seed line. It's tracing one family line, one family lineage. And that family lineage is eventually seen as a royal family. When we have Joseph, who is ruling, in a sense, in Egypt, and then there's a prediction that Judah will have a scepter, and that the scepter will not depart from Judah. And so what Genesis has been leading towards the whole time, from Genesis 3, is a royal offspring of the woman who would end up becoming the king. So that, again, though, is an implicit argument for an individual expectation. The turning point in the interpretation of Genesis 3:15 came in 1997 with an article by Jack Collins. Collins looked at all of the examples of the use of the Hebrew word for offspring, zerang, in the Old Testament. And he noticed several patterns. The primary one in relation to Genesis 3:15 is that every time zerang is used in the Old Testament, zerang is, of course, a collective noun. So it's going to be singular form all of the time, but it could refer to one individual, and it also could refer to a collective group. Sort of like the English word sheep. If you can say, I'm going to watch my sheep, and you don't know whether I have one sheep or many sheep. You would only be able to tell if I give you more information. So I could say I have one sheep or 100 sheep, and I would use the same word because it's a collective noun. And zerang works the same way. It's going to be singular in form, and you only know by the context if it's referring to an individual or to a collective group. What Collins did is he noticed that every time the Hebrew uses a pronoun to refer back to that seed, when it uses a singular pronoun, it's always in that context referring to an individual offspring, an individual seed. But if it's using a plural pronoun like their or them, then it's referring to a collective seed. So in Genesis 3:15, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He is a singular pronoun. And then you shall bruise his heel. His is very clearly a singular pronoun. And so this gives us, based on the analysis of how the Hebrew language works, we understand that Moses, when he uses the singular pronoun, he was very much looking forward to and expecting a singular individual seed of the woman. And so Collins' analysis really changed the game in establishing an exegetical foundation for understanding the seed of the woman as an individual in Genesis 3:15. T.D. Alexander also followed up with another article sort of confirming what Collins said and expanding his argument to a degree. We don't have time to get into the details of Alexander's argument, but he points out that with the Abrahamic promises, some of the promises of seed to Abraham are collective. So it's referring, he's expecting a plural seed. He's going to have numerous descendants. Also, there are some references to seed in Genesis in the Abrahamic promises where we're expecting an individual seed. So the primary example of that is in Genesis 22:17 and 18. The first half of the verse looks forward to a collective seed. The second half of the verse looks forward to an individual seed who will possess the gate of his enemies. And through that one individual seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Another argument for the individual seed of the woman came from James Hamilton, and the other article we assigned was from James Hamilton, showing how the promises given to Abraham are a direct answer to the curses issued in Genesis 3. So when God promises the land and seed and blessing to the nations, to Abraham, those are direct answers to the curses that God had given in Genesis 3. Particularly related to this is the seed promise. And so the promises that God gives Abraham related to seed are a direct answer to Genesis 3:15 with the seed promise there. Now then, if Genesis 3:15 though is referring to an individual, then how can I say that Genesis 3:15 is the foundation for the enmity that we see between the collective nation of Israel and the nations, and between the collective church and the collective world? And so that's a good question. That's a question that I had to resolve, because I argue that exegetically, Genesis 3:15 is absolutely referring to an individual descendant. But what it seems, though, is that the rest of the Bible also interprets Genesis 3:15 and applies Genesis 3:15 in a collective sense as well. So there are a few arguments for that. First of all, in Genesis 3:15, the seed of the serpent is almost unanimously understood to be a collective group. So you have a curse on the serpent, and he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman. So you have two entities right there, the serpent and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. So we have the serpent and the woman, both of them have offspring. So we have four entities now. And then the offsprings, then the offspring of the woman will do battle with the serpent. So we have at least four groups of people. Both of them have seed. And the seed of the serpent is almost always, among liberal and conservative interpreters, understood to be the human race to some degree. Conservative interpreters generally understand it as wicked people who follow after the ways of the serpent, and they may or may not include the idea that demons or spiritual beings who are part of Satan's realm would be part of the seed of the serpent as well. So if the seed of the serpent is understood to be a collective group, then it would give balance to the verse to also understand the seed of the woman to be used in a collective sense as well. Again, it's not necessarily we don't necessarily have to have balance every time we translate a verse and interpret a verse, but it does seem that when they both have seed, they will have enmity with each other, and one of those seeds is collective, it's possible also to interpret the other one as a collective group as well. Another argument is that in Genesis, we immediately after Genesis 3, as we mentioned before, we see this enmity, this conflict between righteous and unrighteous seed lines. So it's as if when Cain and Abel have their enmity and Cain kills Abel, that's the beginning of this enmity between the seed of the woman. And then we have these other seed lines that develop throughout Genesis. And throughout the Abraham and Isaac and Jacob narratives, there is enmity between those patriarchs and the other nations. Abraham gets involved in a battle, and he has some conflict with some foreign kings. Same thing with Isaac. There's conflict between the righteous brothers of Joseph, or between Joseph, the righteous brother, and his evil brothers. And so there's this sort of good versus evil conflict through the book of Genesis that seems to be reflecting Genesis 3:15. Another argument for this is that the arrival of the future individual seed depends on the survival of numerous predecessors. So if there's a promise made in Genesis 3:15, let's just say that's in 4000 BC, and that promise is going to be fulfilled in 4,000 years when Jesus comes, there's going to be an innumerable number of predecessors in between. Now, this is also operating under the assumption that the serpent, after hearing the curse in Genesis 3:15, he's going to work to try to make sure that he doesn't get defeated. So he's going to try to eliminate the seed of the woman before the seed of the woman can crush his head. Also, the seed promises to Abraham are both collective and individual, like we mentioned. Some of the promises are for seed as innumerable as the sand on the seashore and as innumerable as the stars in the sky. And if Hamilton's article and his argument is correct, and the seed promised to Abraham is a direct answer to Genesis 3:15, then it's appropriate to understand that the seed promise in Genesis 3:15 can be both collective and individual as well. There are other key Old Testament messianic passages that refer to both an individual and a collective seed. We don't have time to get into the details of each of these, but in Numbers 24, there's a reference to the multiplicity of the seed. And then in Numbers 24, this is Balaam's prophecy. We also see the expectation of one seed who will come and crush the forehead of Moab. Also in the Davidic covenant, in 2 Samuel 7, it does seem that we have a reference to an individual who will come after David, as well as his house that will be a number of innumerable descendants after him. We also have a number of New Testament passages that seem to perpetuate this theme of enmity between these seeds. Revelation 12 is prominent here. Some interpreters have said that Revelation 12 is a midrash, or a Hebrew sort of interpretation of Genesis 3:15, because the concepts in Revelation 12 seem to reflect what's going on in Genesis 3:15. You have a woman who gives birth to a male child who will rule the nations. Then a dragon comes along and he tries to destroy the child. That child is caught up into heaven. War arises in heaven between the angels and the dragon, who is identified in Revelation 12 as that ancient serpent. So it's hard to imagine here that John isn't referring back to Genesis 3 when he's referring to that ancient serpent. And so there's a war. There's this enmity going on between the offspring of this woman and the people who follow after him, and between that serpent. The dragon is cast down to earth, and he goes to make war on the rest of her offspring. Again, he's using that key word, offspring. And so the dragon is cast down to heaven, and he makes war on the offspring. Who are the offspring? Well, it's those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. So the offspring of the woman is at enmity with the serpent and his seed. And then the dragon comes out of the water, and he has a mortal wound. And where is that mortal wound? That mortal wound is on his head. And Genesis 3:15 says that the serpent's head will be bruised. The dragon is allowed to make war on the saints for a little while. And so it seems very clear that this is a reference to Genesis 3:15. And if it is, then it's interpreting Genesis 3:15 as in a collective sense. We are looking for a collective and a spiritual offspring of the woman, as well as an individual offspring. 1 John 3 also gives some strong indications of this. John says, "By this it is evident who are the children of God and who are the children of the devil." Again, children of the devil sounds an awful lot like seed of the serpent. John says, "Whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor is the one who does not love his brother." And we should not be like Cain. John, it seems like he's got his in Genesis 3 and 4 right now. He says we should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one. Who would be the evil one other than the serpent? And Cain, who is influenced by the evil one. Cain, who just in 2 verses before, he was talking about children of the devil. So Cain, he was of the evil one, and he murders his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. And so what happens with Cain and Abel, I believe, is Cain was working, he was being energized by the evil one, by the serpent. The serpent realized Abel is the righteous one here. So if he's looking for a seed of the woman who's going to defeat him and crush his head, Abel is the more righteous one, so he wants to wipe out Abel, so Abel can't crush his head. And so the serpent then works through Cain to murder Abel. And so then this conflict between good and evil, between those who follow after God and want to please God, and those who are opposed to God's redemptive plan, works itself through the Old Testament. There are 2 key questions that come up in Genesis as it relates to fulfilling this seed promise. And Todd Patterson is a missionary in Eastern Europe, and he wrote a dissertation about 10 years ago dealing with the plot line of Genesis, and he argues that the plot line of Genesis essentially revolves around two key questions. One of those questions is, will the seed survive? So Abel was a seed of the woman, and he didn't survive. So then Eve says in Genesis 4, God has provided another seed in place of Abel because Cain killed Abel, and so God gives her a child named Seth. So then Seth's line goes separate from Cain's line. Cain's line is a line of murderers. Seth's line is the righteous line that God preserves through the flood. Then you have the line of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and that becomes people of Israel. And one of the key questions throughout the Old Testament is, will Israel survive? They are surrounded by hostile nations. And then you open the book of Exodus, and they are in bondage to a Pharaoh who wants to wipe out the nation of Israel, who starts to kill the male children of Israel. And the Old Testament closes with a situation where Israel is in a very precarious position. They have just returned from exile in Babylon. There are some people that have returned to the land, and we still don't know if that seed is going to survive. Another question that arises in Genesis and then flows through the rest of the storyline of the Old Testament is, will the seed remain righteous? So again, if the serpent is trying to prevent his own downfall, he is going to do whatever he can to gain the allegiance of the woman's seed. If he can get the seed of the woman to give him allegiance, then that seed of the woman won't be able to crush him. So Cain gives his allegiance to the serpent. Abel does not. And so throughout the rest of the Old Testament, there's this question of, how can Israel remain righteous? They're in the midst of these other foreign nations. They're so tempted to follow after these false gods. And one of the key concerns throughout the rest of the Old Testament is, will Israel remain righteous? And so both of these questions have to be answered in order for Genesis 3:15 to be fulfilled. So as we look through the Old Testament, we see these concepts, and we see this distinction then between Israel and the nations. And there are several key themes that come up in relation to Israel's relationship to the nations. First of all, God makes it very clear in the Old Testament that his intention is for Abraham's offspring to be recognized as distinct from the nations. And he uses this term, the nations. He also uses the term, the peoples. They're relatively interchangeable as we work through the Old Testament. It's referring to all the people groups surrounding the nation of Israel. So in the book of Exodus, God delivers his people from bondage, and he brings them to Mount Sinai, and he, at that point, establishes Israel as a nation. And he says in Exodus 19, verses 4-6, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice, and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples. So among all the other nations, among all the other peoples around, Israel was going to be God's treasured possession. For all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So what God is doing here is he is telling the people that because they are his treasured possession, he has an expectation for how they are going to interact with the peoples around them. He's bringing them to a new land. And so there are two key elements that God mentions here related to Israel's role among the nations. One of those is that they are to be a kingdom of priests. So what does it mean for them to be a kingdom of priests? We know that God had selected the tribe of Levi to be priests, but it seems here that God is telling the whole nation that they are to serve as priests. So what can that mean? Well, we look at what a priest does and what a priest's role is. And a priest is somebody who mediates between God and the people. He is able to take God's truth and communicate it to the people. He represents God to the people. So what it seems is that as a kingdom of priests, Israel has a role among the nations to show them who God is, to display God's greatness to the peoples, to teach them about Yahweh and his greatness and his ways. And so their role as a priest to the nations would be comparable to the role of Israel's priest to Israel. So the way this would work, for example, I believe is seen in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 5 through 9. God says, I have taught you statutes and rules. Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us, whenever we call upon him? And what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all this law that I set before you today? So what God says here is, if you obey my laws, other nations will see it, and they will say, surely this is a great nation. And what nation has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us? And so I think that's what it means to be a kingdom of priests. It means that through the way you behave and through your interaction with the nations, you are pointing them to God in the same way that a priest would point the people of Israel to God. The problem is that being a kingdom of priests was going to be dangerous work, because the nations around the people were not going to be readily accepting to their truth, and they were going to be hostile to them. And they were going to present their own way of doing things. So meanwhile, while you're being a kingdom of priests, God says, you are to be a holy nation. So yes, you need to interact and engage with the people. You need to interact and engage with the other nations. But while you're doing that, you yourself must stay holy. And that's the basis for many of the laws in the Pentateuch. There's such a strong emphasis on being distinct and being different than the other nations. And so we'll look at a few of those commands here soon. But that's what's supposed to drive the nation of Israel as a nation. They're supposed to reveal who God is to the other nations. If God simply wanted a holy people for himself, he could have put them off on an island by themselves somewhere. But instead what he does is he puts them right in the middle of a sinful culture, and he says, tell them who I am and be holy. So Israel is supposed to be distinct from the nations. And this is part of the way God is planning to fulfill his promise of blessing to the nations. All throughout the patriarchal narratives, God renews this promise to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that says he wants them to be a blessing to the nations. And he promises that through their seed, the nations will be blessed. And this is God's desire all throughout the Old Testament. He says numerous times in the Psalms how God rules over the nations and he is exalted over the peoples. And the obedience of the peoples would be, in Genesis 49, toward a ruler who comes from Judah. In some of the servant passages in Isaiah, Yahweh's servant will be a light to the nations and to the peoples, that his salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. So God's intention from the beginning of the Old Testament was to spread knowledge of him to all nations throughout the earth. We see this continue throughout the prophetic books. So Zechariah promises that many peoples and strong nations shall come to seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem and to entreat the favor of the Lord. So Kostenberger, in his article on the nations in the New Dictionary of Biblical Theology, he says, despite all the nation's detestable practices, God is concerned also for their salvation. And so we see that God wants his people to be distinct from the nations, but also to be a blessing to the nations. In order to do that, they must make sure that they do not follow the practices of the nations. Why not? Well, because the nations are inherently sinful. They are characteristically sinful people. They are people who don't know Yahweh. So in Leviticus 20, verse 23, the command is, you shall not walk in the customs of the nations that I am driving out before you. For they did all these things, and there were numerous commandments about purity and uncleanness. They did all these things, and therefore I detested them. So the basis for so many of the laws in the Pentateuch was that God does not want his people to be like the nation. And so this continues throughout the Old Testament in a number of different passages. It happens throughout the book of Judges. This happens throughout the book of Judges, throughout the books of the Kings, throughout the historical books. The people are drawn to the ways of the nations, and God keeps warning them not to be like nations. So when we get to the prophetic books, Jeremiah says, God says, learn not the ways of the nations, nor be dismayed at the signs of the heavens, because the nations are dismayed at them. For the customs of the peoples are vanity. So the nations are characteristically sinful, and their sinful practices are energized by the false gods of the nations. So the peoples of the nations follow after false gods. You see references to Baal and Ashtoreth, and the people followed after the behaviors that they believed Baal and Ashtoreth wanted from them. And Baal and Ashtoreth were likely pictures of demonic forces that were influencing the peoples in the other nations at the time. And so God is jealous. He doesn't want his people to follow after the ways of the nations. He doesn't want his people to follow the ways promoted by those false gods. But that is what his people are tempted to do. They have all these other nations around them. They're drawn to act like them and to be like them and to take on their customs. And God commands them not to. So God wants his people to be a blessing to the nations. Meanwhile, they're not supposed to follow the practices of the nations. And those who are among the nations who don't turn to God, they will be judged. And we see this also throughout the Old Testament. Numerous references to God's future judgment on the nations. In the Psalms, we see that Yahweh holds all the nations in derision. He will execute judgments among the nations. In Isaiah details how God's going to judge many different nations. And so there's this recurring distinction between Israel and the nations in the Old Testament. So connecting this to Genesis 3, and those two key questions we were asking, will the seed survive, and will the seed remain righteous? When we look at the Old Testament, we see that in the contrast and in the conflict between Israel and the nations, we see that the physical existence of the seed of the woman is at risk. And that answers the question of, will the seed survive? And so throughout the Exodus event, throughout the history of the people of Israel, there's a significant question of, will the seed survive? For example, with David, as soon as David is anointed as king by Samuel, an evil spirit that says it's from the Lord enters into Saul. And so immediately when that evil spirit enters into Saul, Saul does not stop trying to eliminate David. So Saul, empowered by an evil spirit, or energized in some way by an evil spirit, is influenced So where he wants to try to kill God's promised seed. And so we see a number of times throughout the monarchy, for example, when Athaliah becomes the queen, she tries to eliminate all the potential heirs to the throne, and only one is left. He's hidden away. And for a while, that seed line is just hanging by a thread. And so there's a big question of, will the seed survive? And then when Assyria sends Israel into captivity, and they are dispersed among the nations, there's a great question. Will Israel survive? And then when Judah is sent to Babylon in captivity, will the seed survive? And so then there's also enmity against the spiritual welfare of the seed of the woman. And the question here, of course, is, will the seed remain righteous? Because we need the seed of the woman to be righteous if he's going to defeat the serpent. If he's on the serpent's side, he's not going to defeat the serpent. And so throughout the Old Testament, we have seen an utter failure in finding a king who's going to be a righteous king. And so we don't find anybody in the Old Testament who can be that one who's going to defeat the serpent. And that's when we transition to the New Testament. And then the question is, how is the New Testament going to fulfill this Old Testament expectation of a righteous seed of the woman who will defeat the serpent? So Jesus is born in the New Testament, and when he's on earth in his ministry, it seems that the present world order at the time, when Jesus is doing his ministry, when he's at work, it's essentially an arena under one personified figure's control. An arena that, as such, they refer to as a dominion or a kingdom. And Jesus refers to Satan and demons as part of a kingdom, which can't stand if it's divided against itself. And the world then is regarded as an arena of conflict between Satan and his demonic forces on the one hand, and God along with obedient followers who serve him on the other hand, in anticipation of evil's complete annihilation. So when Jesus is on the earth, we still have this conflict between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, and the seed of the serpent has to ramp up its efforts because it knows that this is the seed of the woman who is going to put him at risk. And so the question is, will this seed survive, and will this seed remain righteous? So the world and its ruler are in opposition to Jesus. So the serpent tempts Jesus. And in the temptation, the question again is, will this seed of the woman remain righteous? Or will the seed of the woman give his allegiance to the serpent? And what the serpent is trying to do in the temptation of Jesus is gain the allegiance of Jesus for himself. We also see that the serpent influences Jesus's disciples. So the serpent influences Judas. He enters into Judas and is sort of the energizing force behind Judas's betrayal of Jesus. And what's interesting is when Peter rebukes Jesus for talking about his death and resurrection, Jesus tells Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Because Satan is the one who's opposing his redemptive plan. And Peter was saying things in contrast to what Jesus's redemptive plan was. There's significant demonic activity in the Gospels, demonstrating the continued opposition of the world and its ruler to Jesus. There's significant human opposition to Jesus in the Gospels. For example, political leaders, when Herod finds out about a king being born in Bethlehem, he tries to eliminate the seed. He tries to eliminate the seed of the woman, and it's almost as if there's a demonic influence here in wanting to wipe out every baby under 2 in the city of Bethlehem. And so we see this political opposition to Jesus. We find out that Herod the Great's son, Herod Antipas, who had ordered the death of John the Baptist, also wanted to kill Jesus. And political leaders like Pontius Pilate were involved in his death. So there is a strong political leader opposition to Jesus. There are also religious leaders who are opposed to Jesus. Each of the synoptic gospels presents the religious leaders of the day, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the scribes and the priests, as the source of the most frequent opposition to Jesus. And in opposing Jesus, the Jewish religious leaders prove themselves to be seed of the serpent. And Jesus even uses similar language to this on occasion to refer to them. For example, in Matthew 23, when Jesus is giving his woes on the Pharisees, he refers to the Pharisees as children of hell. And he accuses them of opposing God's work by shutting the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. And they travel far to make proselytes. And when they do that, the Pharisees make their proselytes twice as much children of hell as they themselves are. And so by identifying them as children of hell, of Gehenna, he associates with the seed of the serpent, whose ultimate punishment is Gehenna. After Jesus cleanses the temple, the religious leaders are trying to destroy him. When he's arrested, Luke actually identifies the chief priests and temple officers with the powers of darkness. When the religious were working to convict Jesus and put him to death, Luke's gospel says those were the powers of darkness, obviously connecting the religious leaders with satanic forces. Other times, Jesus refers to Pharisees as a brood of vipers. A brood of vipers, again, that's offspring of snakes. It's hard not to see a connection to Genesis 3:15 there. Later on, in John 8, the Pharisees are insisting that they are children of Abraham. And Jesus says, no, you are children of your father, the devil, because you are doing the things he wants you to do because you're opposing me. And so Jesus, identifying the Pharisees and the Jews of his day as children of their father, the devil, had to have been highly offensive, first of all, but it also connects with the same kind of language that's Genesis 3:15. So we see this constant opposition to Jesus from political leaders, religious leaders, and the world, so that John's gospel says a number of times that the world hates Jesus. Jesus says, the world hates me because I am not of the world and because I convict the world of sin. So again, those key questions come up. Will the seed survive? And will the seed remain righteous? And what we find out is in Jesus's life, as the seed of the woman, he does survive and he does remain righteous and he does have victory over the serpent. Even though they put him to death, even though they bruise his heel, it is through the bruising of his heel that seed of the woman conquers the serpent by crushing his head. So I think this will be a good time to take a break. And then the rest of the time, we'll be focusing on the rest of the New Testament teaching on the enmity between the church and the world. So we'll take, Joel, is this a 5-minute break?
Usually we go 5 minutes. Fabulous. Thank you. Excellent.
Right.
Really just solid core content all the way through. Excellent. Thank you. So let's do that. Let's come back at 9, well, my time, 16 minutes after 9, so 5 minutes from now, and we'll keep on going. Thank you. See you all in a bit.
All right, well, let's continue on. So we left off with the individual seed of the woman and how those promises are fulfilled in Jesus. And we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about the collective seed of the seed, so the church, and its enmity with the world. So in the Gospels, we start to see the same questions arise about the church. So is the church going to survive? And will the church remain righteous? So these are the same questions that we encounter throughout the rest of the New Testament as well and into our day. So what we see is the world and its ruler are opposed to the church as well as opposed to Christ. We see this in Jesus's prophecy of the church in Matthew 16. He says, I will build my church, and the gates of hell, the gates of Hades, will not prevail against it, but there will be a battle. And I believe the gates of Hades refers to sort of gates of the city were in the Old Testament times and in Jewish times, sort of the headquarters of a city. So some people believe this is referring to the gates of a city protecting against an attack. I think what's going on here is the gates are being used in the Old Testament sense, where the gates refer to the place where the leaders of the city would gather and strategize and make plans for the city. For example, Lot in Genesis 19 was sitting in the gates of Sodom. It seems like he had become a leader of Sodom. And so what it seems is that the gates of Hades refers to the powers of hell, Satan and his forces who are working to oppose the church, and they won't prevail. The gates of Hades won't prevail against the church. So Jesus makes that promise, but there will be opposition to the church. In the parable of the seeds, Satan takes away the seed from people who believe, and he takes away the seed so they don't hear the word, and so the word doesn't go into people, and he's opposing the growth of the church this way. Also in Matthew 13, the parable of the tares and the wheat provides an example where it's really interesting because of its use of the word seed. I don't know if Jesus is specifically referring to Genesis 3:15, but there are some strong comparisons between the two passages. So in the parable, the sower sows the seed, and the seed refers to believers who are in the field and they grow up into wheat. And the enemy comes and sows weeds among the good seeds. And Jesus is the one who sowed the good seeds, and they are the children of the kingdom. So Jesus sows the good seeds, which are wheat, which are children of the kingdom. Satan, the devil, is the enemy who sows the seeds in an effort to sabotage the harvest. And the weeds that grow up are, Jesus says, the sons of the evil one. So the seeds that grow up are sons of the serpent, seed of the serpent. And it's actually seed in this passage. And so it does seem like there's a strong, at least an allusion to Genesis 3:15, in the idea that you're going to have seed of the woman, the righteous seed growing up, and the seed of the serpent will grow up with the seed, and God's going to separate them in the end. This also shows up in the persecution of the church throughout the book of Acts. There are very hostile forces throughout Acts and throughout Paul's ministry. We see this happening with most of the apostles. They are persecuted for their belief in Christ. And so we see in the New Testament that the world and its ruler are opposed to the church. So what I've done here is I've shown you that the concepts of enmity between these two seeds is present in the New Testament. What we're going to do next is show that not only are these concepts present, but the New Testament uses the same terminology for the contrast between the church and the world that the Old Testament uses to refer to the nations and to Israel and the nations. So when we look at the Gospels, for example, John has a distinctive use of the word cosmos. John uses the word cosmos for world over 100 times. I think it's 105 times in all of his writings. So this is very prominent in John's writings. The Gospels, though, the other Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, never, they use cosmos sometimes, but they never use cosmos in the same way that John uses it. John uses it in a very strict theological sense, referring to an evil world system or the mass of humanity in its opposition to God. And the Synoptic Gospels never use the term cosmos in that way. Now, instead, the Synoptics use the word ethne, ta ethne, the nations and the Gentiles, to refer to the distinction between God's people and unbelievers. Now, John never uses ta ethne, the nations, in the same way that the Synoptic Gospels do. Talking about very similar concepts, and I'm going to show you that here in just a minute. So John's using certain terminology, and the Synoptics are using different terminology to refer to the same concept. Now, the fact that the Synoptics are referring to the nations does give us a strong connection to what the Old Testament was talking about when it was talking about a contrast between God's people and the nations. So, and what we're going to see is we saw those four sort of principles that I listed for Israel and the nations. Israel is distinct from the nations. Israel was to be a blessing to the nations. Israel was supposed to live distinctively from the nations, and God was going to judge the nations. We see those same four concepts in the New Testament in relation to God's people and the nations, and God's people and the world. So just as a general statement, God's people are seen as distinct from the world and from the Gentiles. So in Matthew 10, Jesus is commissioning his disciples, and he says, "You will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them and the Gentiles." So it's as if he doesn't say you're going before the world, he says you're going to the Gentiles, because the Gentiles are sort of Jesus's way in Matthew of speaking of the unconverted people, the people who aren't the people of God. Then later in Matthew 24, in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus says, "They will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake." So Jesus says, at this time, all nations are going to hate you. And of course, we already looked at the passages from John where Jesus is praying, and he says, "The world hates disciples as the world hates me." And so I think there are two other times in John where Jesus says that the world hates believers. And in 1 John chapter 3, it says, "Don't be surprised, brothers, if the world hates you." So John talks about the distinction between the church and the world, and the Synoptic Gospels talk about a distinction between God's people and the nations. So God's people are distinct from the world or the nations, and God wants to bless the world, the Gentiles, through Jesus and the church. This blessing to the nations that was promised in the Old Testament is going to be accomplished by the church in the New Testament, as Jesus and the church are ministering to the Gentiles and the world. I have here several passages which seem to give parallel statements of what Jesus' ministry and what the disciples' ministry was supposed to be toward the nations, or the Gentiles. It's the same Greek word that's translated Gentiles sometimes and nations other times in the Synoptics, and the world in John. So for example, in Luke 2, this is when Jesus is brought to the temple after he's born. It says that he would be a light for revelation to the Gentiles, ta ethne, and for glory to your people Israel. Well, John says in John 1:9 that Jesus is the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. So whereas he was a light to the Gentiles in Luke, he's a light in John. In Matthew 12:18, "I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles." And so then in John 17, Jesus' mission is to the Gentiles. God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. So we have similar concepts going on. In the Synoptics, it's the Gentiles. In John, it's the world. Galilee of the Gentiles, in Matthew 4, the people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light, because Jesus was doing his ministry in Galilee, and on them a light has dawned. And so Jesus says, I have come into the world as light. So Jesus is light to Galilee of the Gentiles. And he says in John, I came into the world as light, so that whoever sees me sees him who sent me. And then in the Great Commission, in Matthew 28, Jesus says, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. So be a blessing to the nations. And through the church, all nations of the earth will be blessed. And then in John 17, Jesus says something similar, but he says, as you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world, that the world may believe that you have sent me. So where Matthew says this is a mission to the nations, John says this is a mission to the world. So God will bless the world and the Gentiles through Jesus and the church. But meanwhile, while the church is ministering to the world, the church must not follow the characteristically sinful practices of the world and the Gentiles. And so the Synoptic Gospels do something similar to what John does. John is very clear that the world is evil and the world is distinct from the church. But we also see indications in the Synoptic Gospels where the Gentiles was sort of just a technical term for people who are wicked. So 6:33, Jesus is talking about not being anxious and seeking after material things. He says, for the Gentiles, seek after all these things. So there's sort of a characteristically Gentile kind of behavior. And God doesn't want his people to have that characteristically Gentile kind of behavior. He says, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do. So again, there's a characteristically Gentile way of praying, and God doesn't want his people to pray that way. And then in Matthew 20, Jesus says that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. So there's a certain way that the rulers of the Gentiles lead, and God doesn't want his people to lead that way. And John's gospel, of course, does a similar thing. He says the world hates Jesus because he testifies that its works are evil. And of course, John 3 times in his gospel says that Satan is the ruler of this world. So while we are ministering to the nations and to the world, we must make sure that we do not become like the world. So the church must not follow the characteristically sinful practices of the world, and God will end up judging the world and the Gentiles. This isn't prominent in the Synoptic Gospels, but it is there. At the second coming, in Matthew 25, it says that Jesus will sit on his throne, and all the nations will be gathered before him. And out of the nations, Jesus will separate the sheep and the goats. And in John, of course, we see several statements where Jesus is judging the world. Jesus has overcome the world. We have victory over the world. And he came into this world for judgment. And so we see that these same concepts that were prominent in the Old Testament with Israel's relationship to the nations are also prominent in the New Testament with the church's relationship to the world. And so I put this chart together just so we can sort of see how this progresses through the Bible, with the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, and how the enmity is between them. And it flows through with Cain and Abel, with Seth's line and Cain's line, with true Israel and nations, with Jesus as the ultimate individual seed of the woman, and Satan, demons, sinful humanity opposing him, and then the church as the ultimate collective seed of the woman in its enmity with the world. And so that contrast between Israel and the nations remains as a conflict between the people of God and those who follow after the ways of the seed of the serpent of this world. So now we're going to look at a few key passages for the rest of our time from the New Testament letters that help us understand what the New Testament writers are talking about when they're giving their warnings about the world. So first we'll look at Paul and Paul's concept of the world. Paul uses a few key words, and one of them, of course, is ta ethne. He uses the Gentiles in a similar way to which the synoptic gospels use the Gentiles and refer to the Gentiles. Paul's unique, though, in his use of ion. And Paul uses this word ion, which would literally be translated age. And it has a similar meaning to world. So in Romans 12:2, where it says, do not be conformed to this world, that's using the word ion. Don't be conformed to this age. And we'll talk a little bit about the differences between the two of those. In 2 Corinthians 4:4, Paul says that Satan is the god of this age, and he has blinded the minds of unbelievers. And so Satan is working in this age against the church. Paul also uses the word cosmos. He uses it sometimes to refer to just the created world, what God created. Sometimes he uses it to refer to humanity in general, but he often refers to it in a negative, pejorative sense. 1 Corinthians is prominent here where he talks about the wisdom of this world. Paul actually uses both ion and cosmos somewhat interchangeably in 1 Corinthians 1. Randy Leedy, who I think has taught for this group before, he helpfully differentiates between these two terms. He says, ion never signifies the mass of humanity, and cosmos never means an extremely long period of time. When the words are used with reference to sinful humanity and its rejection of God, very little difference of meaning is apparent. So they're very close synonyms when it's being used to refer to the sinfulness of our world, the sinfulness of this age. Cosmos is more likely to be used when the focus is on geography or humanity, and ion is more likely to be used when the focus is on this present period of time. And so Paul refers to, in Galatians 1:4, he says that Christ has delivered and rescued believers from this present evil age, the ion. And so they're somewhat interchangeable. I believe that Paul's key passage on the world that helps us understand what the world is Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1-3. And so we're going to look at that passage here, and we'll see why I believe it's so critical for understanding what the world is. So this is Ephesians chapter 2. Paul begins by saying, you were dead in trespasses and sins in which you once walked. So Paul is saying there's a way in which you once walked. When he's talking about their walk, he's talking about their way of life, their behavior. He says, you once walked this way. So this is the way they used to walk. They don't walk this way anymore, but they used to walk this way. And he says that the way you used to walk was following the course of this world. Now, what's really interesting about this phrase is that this phrase actually uses both of those key words for world. It uses the word ion and it uses the word cosmos. So what Paul literally says is you're following the age of this world. A lot of commentaries and interpreters express various views on what exactly the relationship is between those two words here. Most people end up just agreeing that the words are basically synonymous. And so Paul is doing what he does in other places in Ephesians, and he's just using several synonymous terms in coordination with each other. The use of this construction is probably an appositional use, which means that basically the words mean the same thing. And when Paul says this age, he is just being a little bit redundant. But what he's probably doing here is demonstrating the interconnectedness of this evil cosmos and this evil age. And so this is the way we used to walk before we became believers. This is where we were. We were following the course of this world. And he describes that by saying that when you're following the course of this world, you are following the prince of the power of the air, who is almost unanimously agreed to be Satan. So when you're dead in your trespasses and sins, you walked according to the course of this world, following after the prince of the power of the air. And then he describes this a little bit. He says, this one, the one who's the prince of the power of the air, he is the one who is working in the sons of disobedience. So we have sons of disobedience, and the serpent is working in them. And the word there gives the idea that he is operating in them, operating through them. He's energizing them to be disobedient. And so they're under the influence of the devil. Now, the way they act when they're under that influence, he says, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh. Now, this phrase, the passions of our flesh, is going to become really important as we look at other passages in the New Testament, because that word passions is going to keep coming up in connection to passages on the world. So among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh. And what we are doing is we are carrying out the desires of the body and the mind. And so this is what it means to be walking according to the course of this world. Or following the prince of the power of the air, you live in the passions of your flesh, you carry out the desires of the body and of the mind, and you are by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. You are doomed for judgment. And so this is what it's like to live like the world. And so there's another key passage in Ephesians that most interpreters understand is very closely related to this passage. And there are several key concepts in this passage that also appear in the other passage. The other passage is in Ephesians 4, verses 17 through 22. So when we get to Ephesians 4, this section that's highlighted here isn't going to come up. This talks about the role of Satan in this world. But other key aspects of Ephesians 2 are going to come up again. So when he talks about the way you once walked, so your walk in your former life, that's going to come up. He's going to talk about the passions, and he's going to talk about your passions, and he's going to talk about how worldliness affects your mind. And he's going to use the same exact terminology to refer to those things. So in this, just to review, so in Ephesians 2, we have the age of this world, the course of this world. It's the way you once walked before you were a believer. It's the way that follows the prince of the power of the air. You're living in the passions of your flesh, and it uses several key words for passions and flesh and mind. In Ephesians 4, verse 17, Paul says, you must no longer walk. He doesn't say according to the course of this world. He says, no longer walk as the Gentiles do. So what Paul does here is by using the same terminology in Ephesians 4 that he uses in Ephesians 2, but in Ephesians 4, he refers to it as the way the Gentiles walk. And in Ephesians 2, he says it's the way the world, it's the pattern of this world. He's saying that the pattern of this world and the way the Gentiles live, that's the same thing. And so this term, the Gentiles here, is ta ethne. It's the same one that we just talked about being used in the Gospels. It's the same one that's used to contrast the people of God with the nations throughout the Old Testament. And so Paul here is showing us that when he thinks of the world in Ephesians 2, he's thinking of the same concept that's been going through the Old Testament in this contrast between God's people and the nations, God's people and the Gentiles. And this is a concept that's flowing through. So he says, you must no longer walk. So he's talking about your behavior. He's talking about your former life. Don't walk like the Gentiles do. Well, how do they walk? They walk in the futility of their minds. They're darkened in their understanding. So there is a mental element to worldliness, and there's a mental element to living like the Gentiles do. You think a certain way, and it's a futile way of thinking, and it's not God's way of thinking. These people have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity. So therefore, we skip ahead to, I think this is verse 22, put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt according to deceitful desires. So again, we have that word desires coming up. It's the same word that was in Ephesians 2. So I think the connection of these passages is significant because it does give us confirmation again that this concept of distinction between Israel and God's people and the nations in the Old Testament is the same distinction that God expects between his people and the world in the New Testament. So, and this is just summarizing those findings from Ephesians chapter 4. So then we move on to James, and James offers us one of the key statements in the New Testament on the believer's responsibility toward the world. Some interpreters have argued that James's theology demonstrates polarities, and so there's a good versus evil. There's an ethical and religious dualism that James is presenting, and he uses the world as the counterpart to the church and to the Christian way of life. So Darian Lockett says James charts the universe via two competing worldviews or systems of value, which order cosmological and theological order. Not only are these systems of measure set in opposition, but the world is expressly marked off as contagious territory and polluting ground. So in James 1:27, it says, keep ourselves unspotted from the world. So James's key passage is in James 4, verse 4. He calls the people adulterous. Again, that's recalling Old Testament terminology with spiritual adultery. And when people would go after other gods and false gods, God would say that they were adulterous. Their adultery here is that they are becoming too friendly with the world. The problem with that is that the world is the enemy of God. And so he says friendship with the world is enmity with God. And whoever desires to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. And so he's clear here that believers must not seek a friendship with the world. God and the world are at enmity with each other. This enmity between God and the world, God expects to replicate that through his people and the world. And it's at this point that James may evidence a direct conceptual connection with Genesis 3:15. The question at issue in James 4:4 is with whom the believers are at enmity. James assumes believers are supposed to be God's friends, which would place them at enmity with the serpent, who is the spiritual force behind the world. James doesn't leave any room for neutral ground. And this concept then reflects the pattern in Genesis 3:15. James uses the exact same word for enmity, which is ekthra, that the Septuagint uses in Genesis 3:15 for enmity. So whereas Genesis 3:15 uses this word enmity for the enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, James uses this enmity for the people who are following after the ways of the serpent, the world, following after the serpent system, for their enmity with God. Now, it's not absolutely certain that James is necessarily referring, is alluding to Genesis 3:15, but the connection seems at least possible, particularly if James 4:4 is the center of the theology of James. And you also notice that the passages immediately before and immediately after refer to the serpent and his seed. So at the end of James 3, James is contrasting godly wisdom from unspiritual wisdom. And that other kind of wisdom is demonic, he says. And then just a few verses after James 4:4, James gives an exhortation to resist the devil. And so James has in his mind the devil's involved in what's going on here. There's demonic stuff going on. And right in the middle of that, he's telling his people, don't be friends with the world. And so I believe this is continuing that distinction, the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. Another thing to note here is that in the verse right before James 4:4, James refers to passions. He uses a different Greek word. He uses the word heidene, but again, he's referring to passions. So far, when Paul talks about the world in his key passage, and when James talks about the world, they're both talking about passions. So that is James's understanding of the world. So now let's move on to Peter. Peter doesn't use the term world in the sense, I don't think he uses it at all, and he definitely doesn't use it in the sense that Paul and James and John use the term world. But Peter does talk about the same concepts. And I believe Peter is using Old Testament concepts and terminology again to speak of the same thing. Several interpreters have noted that 1 Peter 2:9 and 10 is sort of a critical crisis point in 1 Peter, where Peter is sort of giving sort of like a cornerstone, a climax, a transition for the book. And a lot of what goes on in 1 Peter revolves around what happens in 1 Peter 2:9 and 10. Peter tells them, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Now, if you've been paying attention and you weren't asleep earlier when we were talking about this, you'll notice that some of this terminology is almost exactly the same as the terminology we looked at in Exodus chapter 19. So whereas God had given Israel in the Old Testament a clear explanation of what his expectation was for them in relation to other nations, Peter is giving his people here an explanation of what their role is in their situation. He says, you are to be a royal priesthood. Sounds a lot like a kingdom of priests. And they are to be a holy nation. And they are a people for his own possession. They're a treasured possession for him. And so these key terms, with these key terms, Peter is using key Old Testament terminology to instruct his believers on how they're supposed to engage in their culture. First of all, and then Peter, right after this, in the next two verses, in 1 Peter 2:11 and 12, he gives them a command which fits along the lines of being a holy nation. He says, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh. These are the exact same words Paul uses in Ephesians 2 when he refers to the course of this world, and people who are following the course of this world live in the passions of the flesh. So Peter and Paul are using the same terminology here. And so Peter, right after he urges them to be a holy nation, he says, I urge you to abstain from the passions of the flesh, because those passions of the flesh are waging war against you. They're at enmity with you. And then the next verse, he kind of gives the idea of them being a kingdom of priests. He tells them, when you're around the other nations, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. And he's using that term, the Gentiles, ta ethne, just like the Old Testament, it was among the nations and the peoples. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. So the church in 1 Peter has the same commission that God gave Israel in the Old Testament. Be a holy nation, abstain from fleshly lusts, and be a kingdom of priests. Keep your conduct among the nations honorable. The themes also occur elsewhere in 1 Peter. So 1 Peter 1, verses 14 and 15 says, do not be conformed to, there's that word again, passions. Don't be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, talking about your former lifestyle. Again, just like Paul was talking about your former lifestyle. But as he who called you is holy, so also be holy in all your conduct. Then later in 1 Peter 4, we have these same two concepts again. Live as a holy nation, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions. Again, that's that word passions, the same word that's been used earlier in the book, but for the will of God. As well, the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do. So the idea is you used to live like the Gentiles wanted to live. That time is up, so stop living that way. Stop living after your passions. So be a holy nation. And then also be a kingdom of priests, because they are surprised when you don't join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you, but they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. So you're among these unbelieving Gentiles. Don't live like the Gentiles. Now, what's interesting here is Peter's mostly writing to a group of people who are Gentiles, and Paul was writing in the book of Ephesians to people who were Gentiles. And it's interesting that Paul tells them not to act like the Gentiles. And so Paul and Peter here are both giving the indication that there are certain behavioral patterns that represent the Gentiles. So to summarize Peter's understanding of the believer's responsibility in their world, they're supposed to be in the world, but not of the world. So be a kingdom of priests in the world, but don't be like the world. Be a holy nation. Be different from the world. Be distinct from the world. And be holy, so that they may see your good deeds and glorify God. So then we move on to John again, and John's key passage on the world, which is 1 John 2, verses 15 through 17. John says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. So John here gives us a helpful description of what it means to love the things in the world. John is addressing, sort of like James did. James was addressing your friendship with the world. John is addressing your love for the world. Whereas Peter and Paul were more focused on don't live the way you used to live. John and James are focused on where your affections are, what you're friends with, what you love. And so if a person loves the world, he's showing that he does not love the Father. And so he defines the world. He says the things in the world consist of the desires of the flesh. And again, he uses the word desires. This is the exact same Greek word for desires that Peter has been using for passions of the flesh, and Paul used for passions of the flesh. James used a different word, but he was also talking about passions. So in each of these passages, the authors are talking about your passions and your desires. So John says that the world consists of desires of the flesh. Now, when Paul and Peter are talking about the flesh, they're likely using it in a sense where they're referring to your sinful nature and the inclinations of your sinful nature. I don't think that's the same way John is using it. John uses the word flesh 22 other times in his writings. He never, in any other place in his writings, refers to the flesh in the same sense that Paul and Peter were using it. He's not referring to that inner inclination towards the sinful nature. Every time John's using it, he's usually referring to a person's body. Sometimes he's referring to a dead body, but he's usually referring to a person's body, their skin, their flesh. And so I think what John's saying here is that the world consists of offering you things that your body desires. So the flesh is your body, and it desires certain things. And so John is warning his people not to engage in the desires of the flesh, not to submit to the things your body desires. Then John says that the desires of the eyes are involved here. Again, I think we're talking about the things that the eyes desire. So your eyes desire certain things. And what probably is in view here is that eyes, if your eyes are desiring something, that's going to turn into covetousness. You're going to want those things. And then the third item John mentions is the pride of life. This likely has a connection with your possessions and having a pride of possessions. Refers to boasting or haughtiness based on what a person has, whether it's material possessions or a high status. But that's all worldliness. It's about what your body wants, what your eyes want, and what makes you look good, maybe, as the pride of life. These characteristics of all that is in the world, they must not become part of an object of the believer's love, because these things are not of the Father, but they're from the world. A lifestyle that is based on fulfilling these kinds of desires follows in the pattern that the serpent demonstrated in his temptations of Eve and Jesus. And a number of authors connect these three items to three elements in the temptation accounts. One of the temptation of Eve and the other of the temptation of Jesus. So in Genesis 3, for example, it says that the tree was good for food. So in theory, that's something that the body desires. And it was a delight to the eyes in Genesis 3. And it was to be desired to make one wise. And that would be connected to the pride of life. You also have something similar going on, I believe, in the serpent and Satan's temptations of Jesus. He says to command the stone to become bread because Jesus would have a bodily desire for food. And then he shows him all the kings. He shows him all the kingdoms of the world. That would connect the desires of his eyes. And then he says, if you're the Son of God, throw yourself down from here. And it's possible that would demonstrate he's trying to get everybody to see him and show how great he is to everybody. So some people disagree with those parallels. I think they fit pretty well. They're not perfect, but they demonstrate that there is a pattern to the things that the serpent tries to tempt us into. Now, not everything that your body desires is going to be a sinful thing. Food is not evil. Possessions are not evil, but they are evil when they're used in the wrong way and when they're fulfilling sinful desires. So John's theology of the world then says that these things are not of the Father, but they're from the world. These are the characteristics of the world, and so therefore these are the characteristics of those who are in the power of the evil one. I think D.A. Carson gives a helpful comment here when he says, all believers have been chosen out of the world, speaking of John 15:19. They are not something other than world when the gospel first comes to them. They would not have become true disciples apart from the love of God for the world. So all of us, before we become believers, we're characterized by world, and we are part of the world. And what God does when he saves us is he rescues us out of the world, and he transfers us into the kingdom of his beloved Son, like Colossians 1 says. So we are no longer worldlings anymore. And we are only that way because God has shown so much love for the world in sending his Son for the world. So let's try to synthesize all of this together across these New Testament passages that we've looked at. So what we've seen so far is that Satan, the serpent, is the chief opponent of the church. And he uses people to oppose the church. And what we also see is that in these passages, there are a few key words that are used: cosmos and ion and ta ethne. And those are very consistently used. And sometimes, like for example with Paul, they're used interchangeably for the most part. There's an emphasis on distinctiveness in all these texts. They specify that the role of the church and believers is to live in the world and among unbelievers, but to be distinct and separate from the world in your behavior and your thinking and your actions. Peter and Paul both emphasize distinctiveness from a former way of life. Paul keeps saying, this is the way you once walked. Peter says, don't engage in the things you did in your former lifestyle. And James and John emphasize the rejection of a desire for or a love for the world. So don't even desire to be friends with the world. And the critical element that appears in each passage is passions and lusts, and that is the key element that keeps coming up. There are also other elements involved, and there are other passages throughout the New Testament, particularly in Paul and John's writings, where they add other factors. But the features that keep coming up, the behaviors that keep coming up, the mindsets that keep coming up are the same here. It has to do with passions and it has to do with lusts when these authors are talking about the world. And so this table shows these key passages and the key connections between them. Again, the key words cosmos and ion and ta ethne in Ephesians 4 and 1 Peter 2. And then you see the epithumia, the passions, showing up in each of these passages except for James, which uses a different word for passions. But you see these same key associated behaviors when you're seeing the Bible talk about the world. What's noteworthy in each of the passages is that they don't specifically refer to culture or pressure from culture. A lot of times when believers are trying to determine what is worldly or worldliness, we sort of look at the culture and we try to decide what kind of movies or entertainment options our culture is engaged in. And so what the authors of the Bible don't seem to be doing is they don't seem to be looking out at what the culture is doing. They're describing what the world is like. John's description of worldliness, for example, in 1 John 2:15, doesn't necessarily focus on sins of the culture, though the sinful culture is certainly relevant in these discussions. The serpent doesn't tempt Eve using pressure from the culture. Rather, he just tempts them to give their allegiance to himself rather than to God, and to trust his words rather than God's words. And so Eve then aligns herself with the serpent, and she chooses the fruit. And since the fall, worldliness is rooted in the human heart, and the serpent so moves in the world to ignite the flame of lust and pride in the human heart. And men become worldly then when they succumb to the seduction of the serpent to give allegiance to him instead of to the Father. And so the point here is that the actions of sinful culture do not necessarily or comprehensively define worldliness. To identify worldliness, the biblical writers aren't going out and picking out which parts of the culture are bad and thus worldly. When determining what actions are worldly, examining what's prominent in sinful culture does not present a comprehensive picture. The world and sinful culture are certainly connected, but the biblical authors describe worldliness in terms of lusts and pride. The accumulation of humanity acting upon these lusts and passions and exercising the pride of life certainly manifests itself in the bad part of culture, but the bad part of culture can't sufficiently describe the world and worldliness. A person may be acting according to his lusts and desires apart from any influence from the culture, and he may be committing deeds that are not approved by or acceptable to the culture. For example, sex abuse, incest, greed. Like those things aren't approved by the culture necessarily, but the person is still demonstrating that he loves the world instead of the Father. He's loving the mindset and the behavioral patterns promoted by the serpent, and he's behaving the way unbelievers behave, and he's acting like a non-Christian. He's acting like a worldling, and worldliness then is behaving like and thinking like the serpent and his seed. So worldliness then, according to the apostles, consists of living like and thinking like unbelievers. And this goes back to Paul and Peter saying, don't live like you used to live. Don't live like the unbelievers live. And this goes all the way back to the Old Testament. Don't be like the nations. As well as desiring to be friends with and loving the behaviors and thinking that is characteristic of unbelievers. So there will be applications of worldliness that are connected to entertainment and movies and music and what's popular out there. And if your desires and your passions are for what's popular in the culture, most likely there are going to be a lot of worldly things going on. So then living in fleshly passions and lusts also exemplifies worldliness. Now, lusts and passions don't comprehensively define worldliness, but they are the key recurring elements in the New Testament descriptions of the world. The basic problem of worldliness is that it follows after the patterns of Satan and those who operate under his influence. A believer who adopts a lifestyle that is not distinct from an unbeliever, he's aiding and abetting the serpent's side in his enmity against God. And he's actually making himself the enemy of God, as James says. And so when a believer adopts the mindset of the world and lives according to the passions of the flesh, he places himself on the enemy's side in a losing battle in which the seed of the serpent will be crushed. And the enemy's final destruction is certain. Well, that's all I have for you for today. Are there any questions to answer, or are we good to go?
It's great. Really, really solid stuff all the way through. Echoes that, so reading Leedy's book a couple of years ago, I grabbed onto his idea linking worldliness deeper back into the Old Testament. Really liked that idea. But the way you've traced it has just tightened that link up.
Yeah, I had the benefit of having Dr. Leedy on my committee. He was my chairman. And so that was helpful to get his perspective on all of that. He agrees with me. So.
Also, that link with the John's Gospel and Synoptics, that's really cool. Wow, that's great. Very helpful. And then, of course, tracking it through the epistles, helpful as well. Just a lot of things here that are great. I think also demonstrating for us when you really treat a biblical theological theme robustly and carry it all the way through the Testaments, bring it forward, it sheds so much light on a concept that we thought we knew, and just helps round out that in a fuller way. And then, yeah, it takes us right into practical theology. So, great. There were other questions here. So what I'm going to do is I will go ahead. We will dismiss our time. Those of you that need to go, and we're past time, feel free to go. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. Dr. Minnick will come with us, Andrew Minnick, and he'll be talking about monogenes, which, just like this, I'm very excited about hearing. So those of you that need to go, please feel totally free. And then if others are interested and have a question and want to stick around for a bit, and Dr. Cheek, if you're able to stick around some, I don't want to hold you up. But there were a couple of questions we could chat about here, some just contingent or voluntarily if people are able to do that. So thank you. Thank you for this time. Really, really excellent session. Brother Joseph Ng, did you want to ask I think you had two questions earlier.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the good lecture, Dr. Cheek. I was just thinking I'll lurk here and wait for the answer to come up later. I have to look it up. I don't remember what I asked. Let's see. I'm sorry. I think one question I had in mind was, what was the significance of John's use of cosmos, a departure from the LXX use of Theophany, and the Old Testament use in general? Was it to inaugurate a new terminology for the church in the New Testament, or maybe just an idiosyncratic thing with John? He came up with logos and stuff like that. So any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I do. It's a great question. I think what's going on there is John's gospel and John's writings in general are generally viewed to be some of the latest of the New Testament authors. I know there are different views on the dating of the gospels. My understanding is that most of the synoptics were written prior to AD 70. And what I would say is, I guess the short answer is that as the church developed, the church took on much less of a Jew versus Gentile flavor. So probably initially it was mostly Jewish. But then particularly as Paul went on his missionary journeys, as the gospel threat spread throughout the Gentile nations, it became less meaningful to speak of it as an Israel versus the Gentiles situation. So what John did is John is very polarizing. He uses a lot of polarities. I try to avoid using the term dualism, but he uses polarities in his theology. And so he ends up, so he prefers using the word cosmos to refer to the entirety of the system of this world as opposed to the nations. What's interesting is that in Revelation, John goes back to using the term nations, and he doesn't really use cosmos in the same way he does in his epistles and his gospel. I actually asked David Minnick about this, Dr. David Minnick about this, because he's sort of the Revelation expert that I know. And so we talked about this a little bit on when it comes to the fulfillment of all of the prophecies about the nations in the Old Testament. John's sort of bringing that together in Revelation, where there were specific prophecies about God's people and the nations. And so he's bringing that together in Revelation. But I think what's going on in his gospel and letters is there's no longer this Israel versus the Gentiles distinction after AD 70, because there really isn't an Israel, and the church has become much more ethnically diverse. And so it's not appropriate to speak of it anymore as Israel versus the Gentiles.
Well, thank you. In Revelation, I guess the nations are redeemable. whereas they are completely fallen in the synoptics, possibly.
Yeah, yep.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Any other questions?